Hi, I want to talk to you today about three different container technologies or container services that are offered by AWS, and those are EKS, Fargate, and ECS. Um, let's jump right into it. The first one I want to talk about is the Elastic Kubernetes Service, so EKS. And this is basically just Kubernetes hosted by AWS. AWS manages and hosts the control plane. You don't have to do anything to set it up other than create it. You don't have to set up EC2 instances or anything to put them on. It costs you about, right now, 10 cents an hour. So there is a fee for the control plane being up. Um, you can go ahead and create the cluster using the console, CLI, Terraform, or EKS CTL. And again, you have no access to control nodes. It's all maintained within AWS. You don't see them, you don't have any access to them. They're also responsible for them, so you don't have to do anything to take care of them. You interact with the cluster with kubectl just like you would with any other Kubernetes cluster. The whole thing is very flexible because it's Kubernetes. So anything you can do on other Kubernetes, you can probably do on EKS. It's just their version of their offering of Kubernetes. Um, so you're not responsible for doing anything with the control plane. You are responsible for standing up and managing the worker nodes. You stand up EC2 instances and assign them to your EKS cluster. You can have it as part of your EKS cluster, have them what's called managed nodes, so it can do some auto scaling. Or you can use a service called Fargate. So Fargate with EKS is just serverless worker nodes. EKS manages the worker nodes. You don't have access to them. You don't need to do anything with them. They spin up automatically. So you're getting out of having to deal with the control plane by using EKS. You get out of having to deal with the worker nodes by using Fargate. Basically, what happens is when you go to schedule a pod, when you deploy a pod, it takes a look at the Fargate profile that you've set up to say what workloads are going to go onto Fargate, and if it matches, say, the namespace or the namespace plus a label, you can set that up in the Fargate profile. It's just a normal pod selector. If it matches, it's going to go ahead onto Fargate and be assigned there. If it doesn't match, it doesn't get scheduled, or it gets scheduled onto a non-Fargate worker node. So you can have a mix of EC2s as worker nodes and Fargate. Each time a pod gets brought up, it's brought up onto its own Fargate node that's sized based on the CPU, memory, and storage requirements. One pod per Fargate node. You don't have any access to them. You don't have any. The containers have no host access. You can't do privilege escalation. Can't do daemon sets, which makes sense because a daemon set is just a pod replica per node, and since there's only one pod per node, they wouldn't make any sense for daemon sets. The big thing that you may run into is if you're using CNI, container network interfaces, or service meshes to control the communication within the cluster, the intra cluster communication. Things like Istio or Linkerd being service meshes, or just regular CNI offerings like Calico or Cilium. You can't do those because you don't have access to these pods and containers don't have access to Linux capability known as netadmin, which lets it mess around with IP tables and networking. You can do some CNI if you use the Amazon VPC CNI plugin, which is installed on every Fargate node, but that's the only CNI option you have. Okay. The third one I want to talk about is ECS, the Elastic Container Service. And this is Amazon's proprietary container orchestration, right? It's an alternative to Kubernetes. It came up when Mesos and Docker Swarm and Kubernetes were all kind of fighting out for the biggest mind share. It seems that Kubernetes has the biggest mind share out there now. But this came up at the same time. It was designed for simplicity, whereas Kubernetes is supposed to be very flexible. ECS is designed to be very simple. Again, AWS manages and hosts the control plane. In this case, it's free. There's no charge per hour. You can set it up with the AWS console, CLI, or Terraform. And again, you have no access to the control nodes. Those are handled by AWS. This is a proprietary solution. It only works on Amazon. You can't do this elsewhere. So if you're looking for multi-cloud, EKS is probably the better way to go. It is simpler than Kubernetes, like I mentioned, because basically it relies on AWS services, not the internal features to Kubernetes, right? So it's just using things like the VPCs and S3 and EBS and all of that, and you can just tie in. So if you're really familiar with the AWS services, ECS might be really easy to pick up. You are not responsible for the control nodes. You could be responsible for the worker nodes, just like on EKS. You can create and manage them on EC2 instances, or again, like on EKS, you can go ahead and use Fargate, so you don't have to manage them. ECS uses a little bit different terminology, slightly different matchup. It's not one-to-one with Kubernetes, obviously, since it's designed for simplicity. It's not going to match up exactly, but they have, instead of pods, they have tasks and services. Services are pods that are going to remain for a long time. Tasks are pods that are just going to run and exit out pretty soon after. That's pretty much it. Hopefully this was a good intro to the three different offerings.